In 2 Corinthians chapter 12, the Apostle Paul is stoned and left for dead. Did he then describe a near-death experience?
I think we actually have an example of a near-death experience in 2 Corinthians 12 when Paul went to the third heaven. Many people think that that experience occurred during a second missionary journey outside the city of Lystra when he was stoned and left for dead. And at the beginning of that experience he said, "I was in the body or out of the body, I don't know, God knows." And he said that twice. That's very characteristic of the way people feel when they're having a near-death experience and feeling as if they're out of their physical body. Paul, after that, went to the third heaven and saw revelations that he said no man is able to adequately describe when they come back.
But are these experiences reserved only for the ancient prophets? Daniel Brinkley's life was changed in a flash when a lightning strike sent him into cardiac arrest. In a moment, he was gone. But the greatest journey of his life had just begun. Daniel Brinkley is alive today, but what happened? Was he, like Paul, escorted into heaven? What is the strange light that thousands of people who have shared this experience all seem to encounter? And is there an angelic presence to guide them? Is it always a pleasant experience? Or are there those who experience the fear of damnation?
Some people claim we invented heaven because we want it to be real. On the contrary, as C.S. Lewis pointed out, what we want to be real is often a real evidence of what reality itself is. If you desire water, there's at least got to be such a thing as water, or there'd be no desire for water. Similarly, the desire for heaven could actually provide evidence that there is something there that satisfies the desire.
In this episode of Ancient Secrets of the Bible, we'll try to discover what lies beyond the light. We are about to look through the pages of the first continuous recorded history of mankind in the book we call the Holy Bible, as we continue our investigation into some of its most controversial stories and try to answer some very tough questions. Is the Bible a reliable account of miraculous interventions, of angels, apostles, and the power of prayer? Or is it just a collection of stories and myth, as some modern-day critics suggest? Both Bible skeptics and proponents from around the world have contributed to this exciting discussion. Some of these biblical revelations may shock and surprise you. Some people believe that near-death experiences offer proof of an afterlife. Others believe that near-death experiences are merely a physiological reaction to the trauma of death. Is there any proof that would support one theory over the other? According to a Gallup poll, as many as 12 million people in the United States alone claim to have had a near-death experience. Countless books and articles have been written about the phenomenon. The stories seem too incredible to be true, and yet many hold to them as proof that death is not the end, that in fact it may be a new beginning. The story of Daniel Brinkley's near-death experience is a case in point, and it is so fantastic that it's best told by the man himself.
There was a sound of chimes as this tunnel moved and surrounded me. And then all of a sudden, there was no crying Sandy. There was no paramedics working on me. There was only me and that beautiful tunnel. I looked ahead into the darkness. There was a light up there, and I began to move toward it as quickly as possible. I was moving without legs at a high rate of speed. Ahead, the light became brighter and brighter until it overtook the darkness, and it left me standing in a paradise of brilliant light. was the brightest light I'd ever seen, but it was also soothing to my eyes. I looked to my right and I could see a silver form appearing like a silhouette through a mist. As it approached, I began to feel a deep sense of love that encompassed all of the meanings of the word. As the being of light came closer, the feelings of love intensified until the feelings became almost too pleasurable to withstand. I had a sense of becoming less dense. The burden of my body had been left behind. I looked at my hand and my chest. They were translucent and shimmering as they moved with a fluidity like water in the oceans or like the flow of silk in a light breeze. The being of light stood directly in front of me. As I gazed into its essence, I could see prisms of color as though it were composed of thousands of tiny diamonds, each emitting a color of the rainbow. This being engulfed me, and as it did, I began to experience my whole life, feeling and seeing everything that had ever happened to me. I believe the divine purpose of the near-death experience shows us that spirituality and medicine can combine, and now science is a part of spirituality, and spirituality is a part of science. And as we begin to resuscitate and look at this, we find a divine pattern in our lives and who we are, and what the meanings of our life is.
The profound intensity of the near-death experience is evident not only in the description of the actual event, but in the effect it has on the person who lives through it. Dr. Michael Sabom is a respected cardiologist whose scientific studies of near-death experiences are opening the door to this mysterious world.
Many of these people, after they've had a near-death experience, become totally different and new people. They develop new lifestyles, new interests, and new religious beliefs many times. So it can certainly be a life-changing event.
By his own admission, Dannion Brinkley had been a self-centered, angry person prior to his near-death experience. Afterward, he felt he had been given a second chance and a message of love to share with the world. Was this change of heart the inevitable result of a supernatural revelation? Or is there a simple medical explanation for what happened?
We know that drugs, not only hallucinogenic drugs like LSD, but even drugs used for surgical anesthesia, can precipitate so-called near-death experiences even when the person is nowhere near death.
There's no reason to think that near-death experiences are invalid because of the use of drugs, because there are many near-death experiences that occur without any drugs being used at all, as for example in accidents. So you can't explain something away by saying it's due to drugs when there are many cases that don't involve drugs at all.
Another common explanation for near-death experiences is that they result from a lack of oxygen to the brain, a condition known as hypoxia.
Some researchers have tried to find out, using computer models, what a typical visual imagery should be for someone undergoing oxygen deprivation to the brain. And what they have found is that the most likely scenario is a dark vision with a small white light in the center, gradually increasing in size to the point where ultimately the person would feel bathed totally in brilliant white light.
Is the phenomenon of the near-death experience simply an hallucination caused by drug side effects, or perhaps a lack of oxygen to the brain? Skeptics say without a doubt that this is the case, but are they considering all the evidence? In addition to a bright, soothing light, many people who have had a near-death experience report that they also felt removed from their own body. This enabled them to observe details about things going on around them, even though they were supposedly dead. Is the out-of-body experience also part of an elaborate hallucination, as critics contend? Experts who have studied the phenomenon believe that explanation falls short.
One theory that explains the out-of-body experiences that people have during the near-death experience is that they're having hallucinations, or maybe they're in a dreamlike state. However, there are some aspects of near-death experiences which this theory does not explain very well. One is the striking sense of reality and spiritual meaning that lasts for months or years, unlike most dreams or hallucinations. Another is the ability to see events that the experiencer should not have been able to see when they were unconscious.
My first study in the early 1980s incorporated 116 patients. It looked at the near-death experience from a medical and scientific standpoint, and my finding, bottom line, was that the out-of-body experience appeared to be a real experience in which accurate details were being observed and later could be proven once investigated and compared to actual medical records. Hallucination from oxygen deprivation is perception of unreality. In both of my studies, what I've been able to show is people during an out-of-body experience, during the time they're physically unconscious, are perceiving reality. So if it's reality they're perceiving, things can be documented with medical records or other sources of information, then this is not a hallucination and it's not from oxygen deprivation.
One of the most compelling examples of an out-of-body near-death experience is the case of Pam Reynolds. At age 35, Reynolds was diagnosed with a life-threatening brain aneurysm. Her only hope was a very unusual operation. In order to save her life, doctors would have to drain the blood out of Pam Reynolds' head. What's more, her body temperature would be lowered to 60 degrees, her heartbeat and breathing would stop completely, and her brain waves would be flattened. Doctors who performed this intense procedure have nicknamed it standstill, because for all intents and purposes, Pam Reynolds would be dead. But was she?
The process of death, scientifically, now is known to be a process and not a point in time. It starts with normal waking reality and ends up in irreversible death. During this process, the body dies at different rates. The problem we have as scientists and physicians is to determine when the brain is actually dead, i.e. when the person is actually dead.
In the case of Pam Reynolds, one of the surgeon's main concerns was seizure activity, which could prove deadly during such a delicate procedure. To guard against this and other complications, Pam's brain and body were extensively instrumented and monitored, which makes what happened next even more intriguing.
Pam Reynolds had a very deep near-death experience at the time that she had documented no brainwave activity, no brainstem activity. So this eliminates the possibility that this was a seizure phenomenon, because during her experience she had no seizure activity on the EEG. In addition, she had plugs in both of her ears, so she could not have physically heard what was being discussed in the operating room, and she could recall the accurate discussions that were going on at the time that she was having her experience.
Okay, I'm going in. Make it quick.
But perhaps the most compelling piece of evidence in the Reynolds case is the detail with which Pam was able to describe a particular surgical tool. During her out-of-body experience, Pam saw a tool which she would later say looked like an electric toothbrush with a dent in it. She also noticed that the tool had interchangeable blades. These were kept in something that looked like a socket wrench case. How could Pam Reynolds have described with such amazing accuracy the details of what took place in the operating room when she was supposedly dead? But does this prove that near-death experiences offer us a glimpse into a new reality that exists beyond the grave? And if so, is that reality always filled with light and beauty? Or is it possible that darkness and fear are waiting on the other side? The majority of reported near-death experiences are pleasant, peaceful events filled with light and love. But this was not the case for Howard Storm, who believes he literally went to hell and back and lived to tell the tale. Prior to his near-death experience, Howard Storm had always considered himself to be a free thinker. He was also an avowed atheist. To him, belief in God was absurd. But all that changed during a trip to Paris in 1985. Howard and his wife Beverly were getting ready to return home when he began having horrible stomach pains. Storm was diagnosed with a perforation in his small intestine. He was told his condition was urgent and would require surgery within the hour. But that's not what happened. The hours ticked by. Howard and his frightened wife, who spoke no French, could not understand why he had not yet been taken into surgery. The agony of his condition weakened Howard. Knowing death was near, he said goodbye to his wife and slipped off into oblivion.
When I opened my eyes, I saw that I was standing next to my bed, and it seemed impossible because I had been dying just moments before. Then I saw Beverly, my wife, sitting in the chair opposite me on the other side of the bed, and I tried to talk to her.
Everything's okay, I'm here. We can go.
But she acted like she couldn't see me or hear me. So I yelled and screamed at her.
Honey, can you hear me?
Nothing happened. Here I was feeling like I was more alive than I'd ever felt in my life, and she ignored me as if I wasn't there. And then I heard voices calling me from outside the room. These people outside the room were saying, "Hurry up, come with us, we've been waiting for you a long time."
Who are you?
I kept asking them who they were, but they were getting very insistent that I had to come with them, so I left assuming that they were taking me to have my operation. I followed these people who had surrounded me and were leading me into this ever-thickening fog and darkness. I became very afraid, but they insisted that I just go a little bit further into this encircling darkness. They started to push and pull at me, yelling and screaming at me, and I fought back as hard as I could. There were dozens of them, maybe hundreds or thousands. I couldn't tell because it was so dark, and to my horror and disgust, they were tearing me apart, gnawing and clawing at me, consuming me. They were laughing and taunting me, and the more they hurt me, the better they liked it. As I lay there in a fetal position on the ground, trying to protect myself from their kicks and their bites and their taunting, I heard a voice say to me, "Pray to God," and I thought, I don't believe in God. And then I heard that voice again and another time. I tried to remember what I had prayed as a child, and it came out all mixed up with the 23rd Psalm and the Pledge of Allegiance and the Lord's Prayer, just little bits of them that I could remember. But the people around me hated any mention of God. The creatures that had been tormenting me retreated far off into the darkness and left me alone for an eternity to consider my life. And somewhere in the pit of despair, I thought about when I was a child and believed in something other than myself. I believed in Jesus. And I called out, "Jesus, please save me," not knowing whether he was real or not. And a faint light appeared into the darkness, and this huge, beautiful being of white light came over me. I was lifted up into this being of light, and I could see that all the wounds in my body were healing in seconds. Never in my life had I experienced such perfect, unconditional, total love. And I knew absolutely that this was the Jesus that I'd believed in as a child. He took me out of that horrible place that I now know was hell, and we began to approach heaven. With Jesus and the angels that he called to us, we went over my life from the beginning to the end, and it was very disturbing to see so many of the negative things that I'd done in my life. But the thing that made it bearable was that I knew that Jesus and the angels and God loved me, even in spite of the rotten things that I had done with my life, and that I could be forgiven for those things.
Incredible as his near-death experience was, Howard Storm is convinced it was real. And the changes in his life since then further bear this out. Storm turned away from atheism and embraced Christianity. He even went through seminary and became a pastor. But this isn't the case for everyone. Many people who have had a near-death experience take away a message that's one of universal love and acceptance. Why are near-death experiences so similar and yet the interpretations so different? How can we judge the authenticity of the messages received? And can we trust the beings of light which have appeared to so many people?
In my study of near-death experiencers, some people report having seen a being of light that they automatically interpret as being Jesus Christ, but that being never identifies itself. That identification is left to the person. In fact, many people have reported having unpleasant near-death experiences during which they see a being of light that emanates evil. Somehow the person knows that this being is Satan. Others have called him the angel of death. And the Bible backs this up. In 2 Corinthians 11:14, the Apostle Paul tells us that Satan himself masquerades as an angel of light, and that his servants masquerade as servants of righteousness. Considering this, the identity of these beings becomes very problematic.
Biblically speaking, you have fallen angels, Satan being the head of those angels, and then there's good angels which are in God's legion. Both of these types of angels, I think, are present during a near-death experience, and thus we need to be very careful about how we interpret what we see during the transcendental portions of this experience, what it means, and the message that it's giving.
The fact that these experiences often contradict a biblical view of death make me wary. This is why I think that some near-death experiences are deceptive visions. Their significance is greatly enhanced because they occur in an altered state, but their message is so contradictory to the Bible that they could be from Satan.
Are near-death experiences a spiritual experience or a physiological delusion? Are the messages conveyed during these events full of truth or filled with lies? And is there a key that might unlock that mystery?
I think what I would tell someone who's had a near-death experience is that it is a powerful spiritual experience, that the emphasis on God that they're bringing out of this experience is real, but they need to go to the Bible to understand what this means, what road to walk down now. The near-death experience is non-directional. It will send you down many different roads, and many of those are wrong roads. And so I think it brings us back to Scripture, it brings us back to the Bible as far as what the road to real life is after death.
In spite of the spiritual messages that near-death experiences contain, or perhaps because of them, many Christians are reluctant to accept them as real. But as it turns out, there may be a biblical basis for these stories. Religious explanations for the near-death experience abound, but science is based on objectivity, and in an effort to learn more about this mysterious phenomenon, a number of scientific studies have been conducted. But how objective can anyone be when it comes to evaluating a near-death experience? If one has a near-death experience, won't that experience be interpreted through the prism of their own history? In other words, do we merely see what we want to see? The answer to that question may lie in a study conducted by researcher Kenneth Ring.
I recently did a study in which I interviewed 31 persons who were blind about their near-death experiences, including a number who were blind from birth. These persons reported classic near-death experiences, and even more interesting was the fact that 80% of these persons reported being able to see things of this world during their near-death encounters. Things they couldn't possibly have seen, and things that we know that they did see because we had independent evidence corroborating their claims. Physically, from an external standpoint, death is certainly a process. But from the standpoint of inner subjective experience, it's just a very quick shift from one reality into another reality, from the physical reality into a spiritual reality.
Can the eyewitness accounts of blind people finally provide us with conclusive proof that near-death experiences are real? And if they are, what is their ultimate message?
I think the message of the near-death experience is that there is something there other than our physical reality. There is a spiritual realm. I also think that there's the message of God. There is a God there. It's similar to the general revelation that we see in the first chapter of Romans that Paul wrote in the New Testament, that the law of God is written on the hearts of all men. And I think that the near-death experience is bringing that to the person's awareness at the time they're in the process of dying.
I believe that God is trying to communicate with this world. He's trying to touch people's lives in a variety of ways, and one of those ways that He's touched millions of lives is by giving them a glimpse of what lays before them in the afterlife, which we call near-death experiences.
People very much want to believe that they will continue to exist after they die. And so they create their own ideas, and our culture has a lot to say about what life will be like after death. And some of the images that we have, like harps and being on clouds or things like that, they are kind of biblical, but not really exactly as the Bible would portray them. But people want to believe that this life is not going to be the end, because as the Bible says, God has actually placed eternity in their hearts. There is a longing for something beyond just this life as we know it.
To date, there is no scientific evidence that would allow us to simply explain away the phenomenon of the near-death experience. Perhaps that's why the spiritual message of near-death experiences seems to resonate so strongly with people all over the world. Certainly everyone would like to know what we can experience when we die.
Besides near-death experiences, there are two pieces of evidence that indicate the reality of heaven. First, there is considerable evidence that God exists, and if God exists, it's quite likely that there is an afterlife, because He would not create people and then snuff them out of existence. Secondly, there is solid historical evidence that Jesus of Nazareth actually rose bodily from the dead. If that is a historical fact, as I believe the evidence indicates, then He has been to the afterlife and come back and told us what it's like. He can speak with authority, therefore, because He has actually seen it since He rose from the dead Himself.
Will we be embraced by a beautiful being of light that may be God Himself? Or will we be deceived by an angel of darkness bent on our destruction? Only one thing is certain. Sooner or later, we will all discover for ourselves the true answer to this ancient secret of the Bible.